I know you love gritty issues. So I wanted to discuss homelessness, I wanted to discuss mental health, I wanted to discuss policing, justice administration, and all these things are in your degree of expertise. But obviously with the recent shooting in America, I'd really like to come at the firearms issue in this shooting from a policy point of view. Let's discuss some of the policy issues around that and some of the considerations that people have to take into account.
Yeah, so America has this problem of what we call mass shootings is really salient at the moment. There have been two gruesome incidents of mass shootings in the past month or so, one in Buffalo, New York, one in a town called Uvalde, Texas. These are not the first. These things recur every so often. There's some debate about how large of a problem is, but when it happens, everyone's attention gets riveted, and at some level, everybody has to make some sort of contribution. Some people talk about the mental health policy side of things. Maybe that could help. In terms of the gun control side of it, which is a side that Democrats in particular emphasize, it becomes really complicated because we're trying to figure out what we could do to prohibit people who are likely to perpetuate one of these mass shootings, put in those types of regulations in place that would not hinder access to guns for people who are generally law-abiding and want to own guns for the reasons that America's had for centuries. There's no one is seriously considering some sort of like mass gun confiscation in America, which is in itself kind of a question because there are just millions and millions of guns already out there. If we want to reduce violence, what does it mean about what are we going to do about those? Does anybody have any idea about that?
Yeah.
But so the way that the debate gets caught up is Republicans resist the idea of like really aggressive gun control measures. Democrats get mad about that, but there's a real question as to whether even if we implemented some of the things that the Democrats want to do, how much of a difference would we see on these mass shootings? I mean, you're talking about radicalization via social media, which is something that really strikes me. I mean, this is really a problem that in America has emerged over the past 20, 30 years. We've talked about it more and more. I mean, before that we had bad guns. We had semi-automatic guns that could inflict lots of harm. But yet there's and all these kids, these young men who get involved in these things have all spent just days, weeks, months on end, just saturating their minds with really toxic stuff online. And many of them have this sort of grandiosity where they think they're going to achieve immortality online as a result of these incidents. So we have to throw that into the mix as well. It's very complicated trying to think about what a policy solution would be, because if a policy is not going to be effective, well, what's the point of doing it in the first place?
Exactly. And look, and you even go back further, you got this idea of okay, so we're talking about mass shootings. So how do we categorize that? Have we even got the right conceptual framework around it? So you've got a gang shooting where someone goes in and shoots up a gang, a whole bunch of people there. Is that a mass shooting? Is that the same kind of thing? Should the public be as outraged by that as they are by because it's still the loss of human life? Are we dealing with the same what category would you put that in? Are you addressing that issue? Are you addressing school shooters specifically? It's just so even getting a conceptual framework is so hard. I suppose people are going to wonder where I stand on this. My answer is I don't know, because the libertarian in me kind of goes, well, people should be allowed to own stuff, but assault rifles, and handguns, and maybe these things really are impacting on. We haven't had another mass shooting since Port Arthur. So maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Suicide rates too. Another thing we've got to consider is suicide, because we know that, and I'm only basically familiar with the literature. I know that this is your bread and butter, but we know that men like using really violent ways of suicide. So We like,
right, you're more like, yeah, more likely to complete the suicide if you have access to guns. Yeah.
yep, absolutely. So, you know, I remember reading a paper some years ago that indicated that limiting access to firearms impacts greatly on suicide, which is actually a much bigger problem, exponentially bigger problem in Australia, and it has been for some time, than murder, which is terrible. Don't get me wrong, but so again, like it's a wicked problem, and coming from a policy point of view, I kind of just, you know, I feel for you having
Yeah, you could,
yeah.
the young man who was involved in the shooting in Texas was quite young. He was 18. He bought his AR-15s like on his birthday or something, or like, almost as soon as he was legally allowed to do so. So that's one thing we could talk about doing, raising the age where you can access rifles of that, capacity. There's some variance between gun laws between states, so there's, a desire to do something a more national solution. But New York, there was, as I said before, Texas, just briefly before that, then Buffalo, there was, a shooting there. And New York is a state which is often thought of as having stronger. It's a very strong democratic state, so the gun laws you would expect to be stronger there. And so it happens in New York, it happens in Texas. So I don't know. And there is this kind of frustration that if what you really want to talk about is murder, violence, well, the bigger problems with murder and violence, as we touched on, have more to do with gangs, inner city social dynamics, and are actually not related to the mass shooting incidents, which in a way resemble more like trying to stop terrorist incidents.
Yeah.
So maybe, those are worth debating as well, but they're probably going to have to be different debates. And if we're so fixated on the mass shooting, maybe we should also spare a thought for, how we're going to do just the broader problems with violence that we have and that we've been struggling with for decades.
You've touched on the mental health side of things as well. Now, one of the articles I read that you wrote was reviewing a book by a chap, Skull, I think it was, who was discussing mental health, and it's something I'm interested in. I'd like your opinion on this. It's difficult to even structure. It's difficult again with the conceptual framework around mental health, because if you look at the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, fundamentally the way something gets in there is it's voted in, and there's Thomas.
Yeah.
There's Thomas, I never pronounce his name correctly because he's Hungarian, Satz or Seitz, SCACZ.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, he discusses this conceptual framework issue where he says, look, when we talk about mental illness, what we're trying to do is say, well, that we're trying to make a division between that person and ourselves and say, well, that person's mad. They're off the spectrum. They are. That's kind of not human behavior. That's wrong. That's abhorrent. It's not who we are as a species. But I'll use his first name, Thomas. Thomas says that look, if human beings engage in that behavior, it is by definition human behavior. So it's on the spectrum. And my understanding of his reading is his writings is he's basically just trying to say, look, a lot of those categories are invented by people so that they can feel a little bit better about themselves, in the same way that we demonize Hitler, going, oh, he was mad. Oh, it's like, no, he was a lot of things, but that man was not, he did some insane things, but like that man was not insane. And I think there's a real danger when we meet, and this is the police officer in me talking too, because like I know a lot of murderers. I mean, a lot. And I know a lot of pedophiles. Like I've had conversations like this with them. And what struck me was the realization it's like, this person's human like me. And I think that once we start to otherize someone else, we forget that the good and evil thing runs in our heart. Like that line runs in each human heart. And if you put the division outside of yourself, I think that that's bad for policy. I think that's bad for yourself. And I think that's more about you protecting your self-image psychologically than anything else. And the reason I raise this is because I'd like your take on, I suppose the conceptual frameworks for, mental illness is like, do we know that a lot of these mass shooters are mentally ill? What is mentally ill? Are we saying that in hindsight just because they did something abhorrent? How would you wrap something policy-wise around that? Like, what would that look like?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's easy to address, sort of, or to get into this through the mass shooting question. I mean, it's hard to know. One reason why it's hard to know exactly whether or not these guys were all mentally ill is because the clearest way that you get diagnosed, like in a clinical way, with a mental illness is the people who that happens to are likely to be receiving some sort of services. But people who are not receiving services, who are just outside the system or will only touch it very superficially, are thinking wild thoughts and are probably a little bit more likely to engage in a mass shooting. So there have been cases of mass shooters who had some sort of contact with the mental health system, who people had concerned about. Maybe they had been like kicked out of some sort of their school or something like that because of concerns about their mental stability. Just looking at pictures of them with these like wide eyes or something, I mean, it really seems like, if mental illness is a real thing, then these guys qualify. But you don't always have that like clear psychiatric history because they weren't on meds, they weren't receiving services. They may be relatively young. Serious mental illness emerges in like, the late teen, early 20s years often, and maybe these guys has only recently engulfed them, and they weren't ever having any contact with any type of mental health services before they perpetuated their act. So it seems to me, the least you could say is that someone who commits a mass shooting is far more likely to have a serious mental illness than just the normal one of the population. In other contexts, there have been lots of studies that look at violence and find that if you compare a cohort of people who have been diagnosed with a serious mental illness, a cohort of people who haven't, the people with serious mental illness are more violent, the ones who haven't received that kind of diagnosis. And so, although there's no blood test for mental illness, we can't do a brain scan. We can't like really define it in the way we can some sort of heart condition or cancer or a broken leg or something. And that's always going to be a struggle. There are kind of rules that we go by that we use to help people, and we research these problems. And there's a general understanding that, yeah, I mean, defining serious mental illness by the rules that we have, people who perpetuate mass shootings are more likely to be mentally ill than not. I think that's pretty clear to me. Now, where you go with that, whether some sort of mental health policy could have caught this person, could have stabilized them, that's a more complicated question. But I would say, generally speaking, if America had a better mental health system, there would be less violence committed by mentally ill people because people would just be stabler than they are.
What would a better mental health system look like?
Well, there are just so many people out there who just have no supervision. Their family are concerned about them. They're unemployed. They used to have a normal life, then something snapped. They're hanging out with a bad crowd. They're taking drugs. They're clearly en route to something bad happening to them. And you try to make services available to them, but because there's so much respect for civil rights, if someone doesn't voluntarily take services, it's very difficult to even keep tabs on that. Just keep an eye on what's happening with them. So they fall through the cracks is the phrase we typically lose. They need some sort of just supervision. So you try to connect them with some sort of program that they like enough at least to keep showing up. That'll help keep an eye on them. There are forms of court-ordered treatment programs that allow people to like live with their family, live in their own housing. But also, I think we just went too far with like demolishing the psychiatric hospital system, which is something that happened, throughout the West. That was We went too far. We were way too optimistic. We were way too confident we were going to build something better. And so, the result is homelessness, very high rates of incarceration. It's different. It's not obvious that it's much better. So we really need to think about building back at least some of that capacity in psychiatric hospitals that we used to have.
That's exactly right. Look, all the training that we did, and the police really didn't do a lot of it. Not none, but that close to none, it kind of didn't matter until really the late 90s, early 2000s. And some of the earliest training, and I distinctly remember seeing this in a video. So the earliest training that we got was like, there were these institutions, they were bad. Okay, we've deinstitutionalized now. We get home and community care. Yes, it does mean that there are people on the street. You're going to have to deal with them. So this is how we want you to, we want you to be respectful, and it was just the moral framing around it. And the legislation really didn't come until a lot later. But I say this with some degree of trepidation, but I think you're right. I really think there needs to be not a complete reinstitutionalization, because, you think of the other, again, anytime you bring in a solution, you bring in a set of problems with that solution. So then you're going to have to worry about sex abuse. You're going to have to worry about people in those places misusing their power. You're going to have to worry about, you look at what happened in some of the churches, for crying out loud. So when you build an institution around vulnerable people, you got to be really kind of careful. But I'm convinced you're right on that. I just don't know what it would look like, and I don't know how people would qualify for that sort of thing. And it's expensive. It costs a lot of money.
Sure, yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that was why people wanted to get rid of it in the first place. I mean, we have more money now. The economy has grown, so we could provide like a level of quality that was more difficult to provide back in the day. But I do think that there are risks that it would be abused. There are examples of people having been committed to mental institutions, just because other people didn't like them because of their political beliefs. I think now in America, in particular, there's a lot of concern about where cancel culture is heading, where certain people are viewed as just dangerous. We're an emergency. The other political side are dangerous people. They want to destroy the Constitution, destroy the system. I mean, I don't know. If you're calling people crazy at some point, some people actually start believing that.
Yeah.
They don't have access to an institutional solution for that. But what if they did? I think it's worth raising that question. However, those aren't really at the forefront right now, because the pendulum has swung too far. The change has been so dramatic that were we to begin to start making slightly more use of psychiatric hospitals than we do now, the people who we would be talking about are those who it has nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with, control over your enemy. It's really people who are just very disturbed. They're living lives that are obviously going to kill them very soon. And so, you just need to kind of hold them somewhere. They'll be provided for, they'll have food and shelter and warmth, all kinds of services, all kinds of things that they don't get on the street. But they are going to experience some restrictions on their freedom. We're not there yet. I don't know if we will get there, but that's, what we would be talking about. And if we did that, we would have less homelessness, less incarceration. People would, more people would receive at least some treatment for their afflictions.